A few days ago, we had a closer look at the Ryzen 7 600X, a monster of a mid-range CPU, great at gaming, surprisingly good at everything else. Just overall a great choice for the average consumer or gamer for the next few years. And I would definitely advise you to go watch that video first, because I'm not going to repeat a bunch of stuff again. However, we also got a 7 900X in-house, so let's have a closer look at that. Compared to the previous Gen 5 900X, we still have the same 12-core 24 threads count, but the new one got the same kind of special treatment as the 7 600X did. A full gigahertz more on the base clock and a solid 800 MHz more boost clock, accompanied by 12 megs of additional combined L2 and L3 cache. And if we've learned anything from the 7 600X benchmarks, then it's that we are going to have a great time. For our testing of every Ryzen 7000, we used a X670E GB Aorus Master. The memory in use are two sticks of 16GB G-Skill Trident Z5 Neo, DDR5 running at 6000 MHz CL30. For our Ryzen 5000 comparison, we used an Asus X570 Tough Gaming Plus motherboard. However, as the last generation was a DDR4 only platform, we decided to use two sticks of 16GB Thermaltake Tough RAM at 3600 MHz CL18. On Intel, however, we decided to normalize it with our 7 900X comparison as far as possible. For these CPUs, we use an ASRock Z690 Taichi in combination with the same Trident Z5 memory. Here, just keep in mind that the G-Skill memory has been specifically made for AMD, hence there is an Expo profile available but no XMP. But we made sure to manually set the same speed to average both platforms out to the fullest extent possible. For the rest, we used a bunch of Samsung 980 Pros in combination with a Be Quiet Dark Power 1200 watts power supply. And to make sure that the CPU is the main thing that we measure, we used an RTX 3090 Ti all in 1080p. And to fully disclose everything, all of our benchmarks have been performed with our BIOS setting reset to default and then setting the correct RAM speed with Expo or DOCP, or manually setting them in Intel's case. Furthermore, Intel CPUs have all of their velocity boost and overall boost technologies active, so they were able to boost to whatever they are capable of. For Ryzen 5000, we did two runs, once with only DOCP enabled and the other one using PBO. All of our results were created by averaging out 3 runs. And just as it was for the 7 600X, we had to endure the crushing realization that no matter what we did to any PBO setting, it just lowered down our scores. This is the reason why we split up the Ryzen 5000 benchmarks into separate PBO enabled and disabled runs, while all of our Ryzen 7000s got only an Expo enabled run and PBO disabled altogether. And now let's finally get to it. Starting off with CPU Z. For the multi-threaded workloads, the 7 900X managed to score 11,990 points, just a tick behind the PBO enabled 5950X, mostly due to the insane amount of cores that these things have. Compared to the previous generation, this puts it about 26% ahead, and compared to the competition i9 12900K, this puts it about 5% in the lead. For single-threaded workloads, it is actually at the exact same spot. Just very slightly behind the 12900K, the 7 900X marked the second spot at 793 points. But still 26% in front of previous gen. Coming to Cinebench, in both single and multi-thread, the 7 900X reached the first spot, once at 29,000 points and once at 2013. For single thread, this puts it 27% in front of the 5 900X and 4% in front of the 12 900K. For all core, we are looking at a way bigger gap, 41 for the 5900X and 8% for the i9. On 3DMark's time spy, the 7 900X did not manage to outperform neither the 12 900K nor the 12 700K, and compared to the previous gen, it ranked 7% higher on the global score and 37% higher on CPU only. Coming to 3DMark's thread scaling CPU profile benchmark. In here, the new Ryzen 7000 line truly shined. Going from all threads down to 1, the 7 900X dominated the chart with every thread count, but not until the very end. Once only 4 threads were left, the smaller 7 600X took over and dominated until the very end. Maybe not by a lot, but still, probably due to the higher clock speed. Nevertheless, compared to the previous gen, the uplift in performance started off at 17%, while using a single thread, and slowly grew to 33% performance increase once every thread was being used. Compared to the 12900K, the benefits are quite big, though not always. Although it started off at only a single % difference, it gradually grew to 15% on 16 thread, but then fell down to plus 11 once all of them were active. PC mark was a pretty weird one. Although the 7900X was pretty high up there and outperformed every Intel CPU, the 5900X without PBO just dominated this chart, and I really can't get why. It shouldn't, but it did. The 5800X3D makes sense, it's a global benchmark, and the 5800X3D is an amazing gaming CPU, but the 5900X shouldn't be there. It's weird, but those are the results. While performing the Corona render test, the 7900X managed to finish the job in 47 seconds, a full 17 seconds quicker than a stock 5900X and 9% quicker than a 12900K. The only thing it did not manage to beat is an unlocked 5950X. The higher clock speed and IPC doesn't seem to outweigh the benefit of having more cores. Rendering out a 2 minutes Premiere Pro timeline with various effects showed how close the 7900X is to the 12900K. Being only 0.3 seconds slower barely counts as a difference and could also just be a margin of error, but still the 12900K won this round. Compared to the previous gen, the 7900X made some huge advances as well. Getting the render time down by 37% is a fantastic uplift. In an H.264 to H.265 encoding and handbrake, the 7900X managed to get back the first spot. Here, the 7900X brought the 5900X's time down by 32% and the 12900K's by 25%. And as the last non-gaming related benchmark, we have Blender BMW. Again, scoring the first spot, the 7900X brought the 5900X's time down by 30% and the 12900K's by 9. Coming to gaming, in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, the 5800X3D still remains on the first spot with 269 FPS, but the 7900X is closely behind at only 9 FPS average less. Compared to the previous generation, we are looking at an uplift of 21% and 11% compared to the i9. Over on Far Cry 6, the 7900X took the first spot again. Being already dominated by mainly AMD CPUs, the 7900X beats its predecessor by 33% in average FPS and its Intel 12900K counterpart by 15. In Metro Exodus, the highest average FPS were achieved by the 7600X with the 7900X closely behind. The 12900K followed after 11% and the 5900X was 30% behind. Coming to the most AMD-friendly benchmark, Formula 1 2020. Here the 7900X dominated again, scoring 447 FPS on average. This puts it 41% ahead of the 5900X and 26% ahead of the 12900K. So just like the 7600X already is, the 7900X is just as insane with an extra kick in core count. Comparing both the 7600X and 7900X, the differences really only come to shine when you can utilize the cores that the 7600X doesn't have. In things like Cinebench, it is just normal that a 7900X scores 93% higher. It has a lot more cores. But once you turn most of them down and just do a single thing, the difference between the two of them is only 1 to 3%, give or take, depending on the benchmark. Far Cry 6, for example, stayed between a 1 and 6% uplift, going from a 7600 to a 7900X. For Shadow of the Tomb Raider, it ended up in a similar way, 3% average FPS change. PC Mark and TimeSpy, on the other hand, registered an 8 and 10% increase due to them fully utilizing all cores. We also made sure to calculate an average performance uplift or downfall categorized by the type of benchmark. For a 7900X versus 7600X, we are looking at a 2% better game performance. And here keep in mind that I intentionally left away the maximum and minimum frames per second of each game, because leaving them in can make very quickly a huge difference because of coincidences. Imagine stating that a CPU is 94% better just because my neighbor decided to clean his power outlet with a wet toothbrush. Comparing a 7900X to a stock 5900X revealed that we got an uplift of 25% in benchmarks like renders and that type of bigger workload. But the most important comparison is still the 12900K. Although the 7600X was surprisingly close to what Intel had to offer in the consumer market, that one was never intended to be the main competition. For the 7900X, the 12900K certainly is. For CPU-intensive workloads, we are looking at an 8% difference. And while 8% uplift in things like video editing and rendering might not sound like the world, I would like to remind you that the 12900K is the best Intel has to offer for the average consumer, but for AMD, the 7900X is not. that thing is just the second player. But concentrating only on the 7900X, that thing is a beast. It can game, though only a tiny bit better than a 7600X, but it's got a lot more horsepower for intensive tasks. And on that front, as far as my own benchmarks and the CPUs that I have access to are concerned, I did not yet play with anything that has more horsepower than this thing. Sure, depending on the workload, a 5950X might get a first spot here and there, thanks to its higher core count, but as soon as the speed is a bigger factor, the 7900X takes it back. And as far as Intel is concerned, right now it looks rather dark. Until now, Intel had a lot to offer. The 12900K was still unbeaten in many ways, and they had QuickSync, which is a huge deal for some people. Me, for example. And to get that, you had to pay a premium for the platform and live with the knowledge that you just paid a company that named their mobile CPUs by using randomwordgenerator.com. Now, however, a 7900X has an encoder built in and it kicks the 12900K's ass, while it's kept the old 5900X launch price tag. But while having a lower release MSRP than Intel. Sure, the platform is kinda going into a more expensive direction, but it's still less than Intel. So yeah, this thing is an amazing workhorse. Gaming, heavy-duty workflow. No matter what, it can handle it perfectly fine. 26% overall performance increase compared to previous gen, 11% overall increase compared to a 12900K. This thing is unstoppable. Yeah, maybe this one will stop it, but you get the point. However, before the video is over, I wanted to talk a bit about the eco mode that we already saw on the 7600X. Not to be mistaken, eco is just a fancy way of saying I'm going into BIOS and telling you that you are a 65-watt TDP CPU and you'll be okay. For the 7600X, it wasn't very impressive. Sure, going down from 110 watts package to 90 is 20 watts and 20 watts is 20 watts. Just imagine being heavily addicted to Cinebench multi-thread benchmarks while living in Denmark. Those addictions are expensive up there. But the 7600X was a 105 watt CPU and the 7900X is 170 watts. So I wanted to give it a try. During a never-ending, slightly mesmerizing session of watching Cinebench go on and on, a stock 7900X was pulling about 180 watts through the cable, while 6 of its cores were sitting at 5.3 GHz and the other ones at 5.1. Because, you know, up to boost can also just mean a single one during a single thread workload. Anyway, after going into BIOS and telling it to stop because continuing would set me back about 6 grand a year, it did go down. Even a bit too much. 60 watts on the cores and about 90 on the whole package. Now, before we continue, in AMD's presentation they talked a fair bit about the eco mode being a good way to sacrifice a tiny bit of performance for a lot of electricity. They even went as far as to say that a 7950X, whose both legs are broken at 65 watts, is still performing better than an uncapped 200 plus watts 5950X. Now, I don't know how this translates to the smaller 7900X variant, but they are so right about this. In ultra cripple mode, the 7900X lost 5% in CPU-Z single and 19 in multiple. For Cinebench Multi, it lost 15. On 3D Mark CPU profile test, it started at 0 and slowly built up to 16%. For the render test, it looked somewhat the same. However, in games, it looks barely noticeable at all. And in some rare cases, mostly single thread intensive, it actually didn't cost anything at all. A %1 in Cinebench single thread and 1% 1 in Formula 1. But look at this. In Shadow of the Tomb Raider, the 7900X in cripple stayed at 259 FPS. The 12900K below it is pushing 234 FPS, and while doing so, it is blasting roughly 220 watts through the pipe. And now add this to the Cinebench addiction calculator and you just saved yourself a whole bunch of money by switching the platform. So yeah, the 7900X in eco mode is definitely something interesting and worth having a closer look at. Usually I'm not that into powering down my hardware. Usually I'm more like trying to push it up, but while measuring the power I also had a quick glance at the temps. And losing 1 or 2% in games actually allowed the CPU to drop from 90 degrees C down to 71. Room temperature ignored for now, but still very interesting and definitely worth keeping in mind in case you don't always need that extreme performance. So for the 700X as a standalone chip, considering its performance uplift compared to previous gen and the fact that they just knocked Intel out of the game whilst being more affordable, less impossible to cool and a lot more power efficient, I can see this being used for everybody in need of a powerhouse but not being ready to pay the $700 premium for that extra 50 in the name. On the last side note, just as it was for the 7600X, our Civilization 6 benchmarks look really weird. It doesn't make any sense that everything beats the whole Ryzen 7000 lineup. Something is just not right here, and I still do not have an answer for it to why, but I will keep you updated once I find out. But okay, I believe this should be it for the 7900X. I hope it was what you were looking for, and if you haven't watched our 7600X coverage yet, have a look at that one. As part of our Ryzen 7000 coverage, we are also doing those how much cooling do you need videos, and yeah, you want to be sure to not miss the 7900X part, because there is a surprisingly small amount of air coolers that can handle this thing, so make sure to be subscribed to not miss that one. But as of now, I hope you enjoyed it, and also a big thank you to AMD and all the people in between that made it possible so that we could cover this puppy here today. Thank you for watching and hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.